This one made me laugh. It made me cry. This, I think, should be on the school curriculum. Genuinely one of the best books that I've ever read. December, every sign has its own mode. From the Diving Board is a show hosted by me, charlichats, dedicated to decoding digital culture by unpacking the hidden politics behind the screen. Welcome back to another episode of From the Diving Board. I'm talking about book recommendations, and not only book recommendations, but I'm talking about long form content recommendations, because we are undeniably living in an attention economy, shock horror, something I talk about all the time, and my attention span is absolutely abysmal. I frequently find myself sitting down to read a book and suddenly my phone's in my hand and I'm on Instagram and I have no recollection of how I got there. So this is not only a series of recommendations for everyone on the books that I've been reading, long form content that I've been consuming, articles that I've been reading to either research for videos that I've been making or just on the side. Not just for you guys, but it's also to ensure that I actually read in my spare time. It's really actually encouraged me to pick up a book instead of my phone. And so today I will be going through these books. These are my recommendations and the books that I've been reading over the last few months since my last video about reading. I feel like there's not really much to be said, really. It's a casual episode today, not a video essay, but of course I will be posting video essays fairly regularly, and the next episode will be a video essay. And if you want more video essays, feel free to go back into the archives and have a look at the various video essays that I've done, because I think I've now got a catalogue of about 20, which to me is insane. Let us get into the episode. All About Love by Bell Hooks. Now, so much of the research that I read at the moment for my content being very heavily focused on gender, social dynamics, social relationships, and community usually, often I will read things which quote Bell Hooks. So she's been on my list to read for a very, very long time. She's basically got an insane archive of incredible work. She managed to write something like 30 to 40 books over her lifetime on matters of really important feminist critique, usually on the intersection of racism and feminism, and the unique perspective of her being a Black American writing on issues of feminism. She was one of the first to basically recognize that white feminism is a thing, and that feminism in its sort of second wave portrayal could actually end up hindering the lives of Black women in an American context. And so she wrote at length on that particular experience. And because of this, because of her incredible world, her incredible thoughts, her incredible words and ideas, she will be forever someone that I look up to with great respect. And so to sort of get an entry level into her work, I read All About Love. This, I think, should be on the school curriculum. I think this book really lays out in a relatively simple format why, as a culture and society, we very frequently have a very foggy understanding of what love is. And she basically, her entire thesis is that many of us don't actually know true love and don't know how to love. Love being an action rather than something you just feel, something that happens to you. She talks about how love is actually a doing word. Great song. And she basically intertwines her own anecdotal perspective and experience with research that either she's undertaken or others have undertaken. And honestly, I thought it was a really powerful book. It only took me a couple of days to read. And as I said, required reading. This is required reading for you guys, okay? I think it's fantastic. But as with every one of these episodes, I have a couple of issues with the book. To give it a little bit of context, let me get the publishing date for you. Late 90s, early 2000s book. Okay, my first bone to pick is she heavily uses ideas of gender throughout the book, which I don't necessarily have a problem with. However, her idea of gender is pretty black and white and not very fluid. You know, she's very much referring to cis women and cis men when she talks about gender in this way. And what this ends up doing is it causes a little bit of confusion in non-heterosexual relationships. So I would be fascinated to know what her thoughts were in relation to this concept in queer relationships, which she doesn't touch on at all in the book. It's quite, black and white heterosexual idea of love. Her theory is really only applied to that context. So that's one thing to keep in mind with this read. The second thing to keep in mind is, for some reason, as you get further and further along, she seems to get more religious. And I'm not a religious person. I'm like agnostic, I would say, but I personally found this a bit off-putting. If you're not a religious person, to me, read a little bit like I just wanted to skip through these segments. And I really did try to give it a good go though. Like I did read the segments about religion, but I find the organization of religion very off-putting in general. Didn't completely resonate with me as someone who wasn't Christian, Catholic. I will leave that up to you. If you are religious, maybe it is quite powerful. It was just a little bit like, oh, okay, kind of came out of nowhere. Anyway, I still give this one, I think I'd give it a 4 because she kind of just reinforced things that I already believed in, but that's partly probably because I have read her works indirectly through other people who have quoted her in the past. So chances are if you're watching me and you kind of read other feminist literature, you've probably actually kind of been exposed to these ideas before. But if you haven't, I still think it's a great read. And even if you have, I still think it's worthwhile. So add this one to your list. I have been getting into fiction lately, and every time I read a good fiction book, I remind myself how much I love a good fiction book. And something about me is my favorite genre of fiction is Australian kind of nostalgia. I think it's because it's such a limited experience that we get to have our society represented in literature, in media, and I find our society actually really fascinating and would love to do some more Australian centric videos on this channel because we do have a very unique experience here, a very unique culture dependent on so many different factors. Our history of immigration, we've got quite a heavy classist society, even though we like to view ourselves as classless, and so I often find these ideas of class written about in Australian fiction really engaging, gripping, interesting. And so one that I recently read was All That's Left Unsaid. This one's by Tracy Lynn. This was fantastic. If you've read Boy Swallows Universe, which is kind of like an Australian magical realism book, I think you'll love this. I picked this one up from the Op Shop for $2. Op Shop thrift store for you non-Aussies out there. This one made me laugh. It made me cry. Essentially, the concept is it's kind of like a mystery turn sociological exploration of life in Southwest Sydney in the 90s from the perspective of a Vietnamese immigrant with her family. It's very much looking at topics and themes of class, racism, systemic failures of systems such as the police. There's also a murder is kind of the plot. I'm not going to give too much away, but it ends up, you kind of go into the book thinking it's going to be more a murder mystery, and it ends up being quite a beautiful portrayal of culture and the experience of this kind of niche part of Australia at a very specific time. And I think one of the reasons why I loved this book so much, so Tracy Lynn actually lived in Cabramatta in Sydney for a period of time, but she based the book to make sure that she got the details right for the context it was in on the work of Dr. Mandy Thomas, her book called Dreams in the Shadows, Vietnamese Australian Lives in Transition, as well as the ethnographic research of Dr. Lisa Ma. And essentially she speaks about how she lived in Cabramatta as a child, and so she definitely has that childlike wonder, but also backed up by the research to kind of give a broader perspective of what's actually going on. You know, there's kind of some advocacy in here, requirements for significant systemic change. If you have any book to read to take away, fiction book from today, I would say my ultimate gold star fiction recommendation is All That's Left Unsaid. Next book I have put all over my social media. If you've been following my social media, my Instagram, and you haven't seen this book, I'm genuinely impressed. This is Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. I've actually spoken at length about this book in an episode I did on the popification of politics, which basically looked at the ways in which our forms of media really dictate and influence the content that's being said. And this is basically the entire thesis of this book that was written, a non-fiction book written in 1985. So the concept of this read is essentially that Neil Postman, who was an academic in the United States, looks at two big philosophical texts, I suppose, to kind of dictate or explain the future, what was likely to happen in Western society in the future. The two texts that Neil Postman looks at are 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. And essentially Postman says that although 1984 had so much more kind of a hold on our understanding of democracy, government, the real threat we thought for a very long time there was the fact that surveillance culture would essentially turn out free democracy into an authoritarian, totalitarian state. And yet we didn't look in depth at the real threat that was outlined in Huxley's Brave New World, which was the idea that we would essentially independently oppress ourselves and disenfranchise ourselves from democratic participation in government by consuming too much entertainment. And this idea is basically furthered and explored by Neil Postman in this book, where he essentially says that the fact that we even have majority of media that we consume now is on television, this was in the 1980s, means that we can't understand the themes that are being spoken about on television with a non-entertainment perspective. For example, on the news, there'll be a news story about a tragedy followed very quickly by a success that's happened in the celebrity world, the Grammys, for example, and then sport. The fact that these things are said so quickly against each other takes away the meaning from pretty much everything serious. And then usually that's followed by an ad break. Suddenly we're talking about tragedy, then we're talking about celebration, now you're getting sold a vacuum cleaner. How can you possibly take any information that you hear and view on television as having any weight when everything else surrounding it is not as serious as the tragedy being spoken about, if that makes sense? So he goes far more in depth, far more eloquently than what I just said about this. And it's fantastic, particularly because I can't quite believe this was written in 1985 when we're living in a time now where this could not be more necessary than ever. This is another required reading, honestly. I'm giving this one a 5. And he didn't at any point come off as condescending. I think the idea of this book might put a lot of people off because we are so heavily dependent now on technology that it feels almost snarky when someone tells you to just get off your phone or when someone tells you that life is better offline, because a lot of us can't really detach ourselves from the online world. And he actually doesn't advocate for no TV at all. Like, he's not saying here that in the TV context of the 80s, he's not saying here that TV is the problem. He's actually saying that TV is better suited for reality TV, for entertaining TV, and for kind of entertainment in general, and that politics, current affairs, and more kind of intellectual discourse should be in other forums. And he's very careful to suggest that those forums should still be accessible to the general public. One of the most interesting parts I found in the book was when he was talking about the public debates that happened years and years ago. I kind of want to read this section out because he writes about speeches that public intellectuals used to deliver to thousands of people in public town halls for hours on end, and people would sit and listen. And he talks about this one particular debate between Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas in 1858 in Ottawa, Illinois. He says the arrangement provided that Douglas would speak first for 1 hour, Lincoln would take an hour and a half to reply, Douglas half an hour to rebut Lincoln's reply. This debate was considerably shorter than those to which the two men were accustomed. In fact, they had tangled several times before, and all of their encounters had been much lengthier and more exhausting. For example, on the 16th of October, 1854, in Peoria, Illinois, Douglas covered a 3-hour address to which Lincoln, by agreement, was to respond. When Lincoln's turn came around, he reminded the audience that it was already 5 p.m., that he would probably require as much time as Douglas, and that Douglas was still scheduled for a rebuttal. He proposed, therefore, that the audience would go home, have dinner, and returned refreshed for 4 more hours of talk. The audience amiably agreed, and matters proceeded as Lincoln outlined. Postman then says this: "What kind of audience was this? Who were these people who could so cheerfully accommodate themselves to 7 hours of oratory?" The death of the public intellectual is something that I'm going to be speaking about a bit later today. And this book really puts into context just kind of the way that we've failed to accommodate media that adequately conveys intellectual understandings to an accessible audience, to everyone, with a means that is actually able to competently show how important the message actually is and the weight of the message that's being said. So anyway, very much recommend this book. All right, next up we have Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. This is a bestseller. Many of you will have read this one. This one's by Gabrielle Zevin. I really enjoyed this book. Off the bat, I'm giving it a 3.5, maybe a 3. Not because it's not good. I think it's a fantastic book. I really love the writing. I love the world building. Essentially, the idea is two best friends, a man and a woman, very much the entire story was to kind of ensure that they remained platonic, which I really enjoyed because when does that ever happen in fiction, honestly? A lot of discussion actually in this book from a fiction perspective about friendship and platonic love being one of the most powerful forms of love, which evidently I've spoken about previously in my videos. This is something that I literally will scream from the rooftops. I found it really interesting because I actually have pretty much no understanding of the video games world. Like, this is kind of the plot basically is these best friends end up kind of developing video games and it follows them through the 90s. Bit of a theme happening here with this era in the United States and their development journey and the difficulties they face and the amazing things that they can do together. And yeah, anyway, I really enjoyed it. It got kind of strange towards the end, I have to say. Like, I feel like 2/3 of the way in it could have been done. And funnily enough, like sometimes the characters were really unlikable to me. I kind of was like, oh, like why would you do that? But I know not every character is supposed to be likable. Obviously, from my Carrie Bradshaw video, sometimes the point is that they're not likable. Really enjoyed this one, and that's coming from someone who has literally no experience in video gaming other than designing the Mii on Wii, your Mii character, coming up with an outfit on Sims for your Sim and only solely focusing on designing the house, and Stardoll. So, you know, like really got an extensive resume there of video game experience. I don't know what to say with these videos. Like, I'm like, good book, next. Like, okay, last but not least, and I'm hesitant to include this because I haven't yet finished it, but I keep raving about it. I'm still only halfway through. It is Naomi Klein's Doppelganger. I feel like I've yapped on about this book in my latest episode in relation to rage bait and personal branding. So if you want a more in-depth analysis and exploration of the themes that Naomi Klein ends up talking about in this book, I would recommend watching my previous video on rage bait because I go kind of into more depth about like actually exploring how those themes work in practice. But essentially the idea is very much based on Naomi Klein, who has a very strong history of writing about corporate America, anti-capitalism, the climate crisis, climate change, and the ways in which corporations end up profiting off of crises. She was getting heavily mistaken during the pandemic for Naomi Wolf, whom you might know her from her 1990s book, The Beauty Myth, about feminism. But during the pandemic, she actually turned extremely anti-establishment, anti-vaccine, and a very heavy conspiracy theorist, actually quite a dangerous one at that. She really aligned herself with Stephen Bannon, who used to work with Donald Trump during his first term. She aligned herself with a lot of now MAGA people who had a strong agenda to bring Donald Trump back in for a second term, which they successfully ended up doing. So she arguably had a significant hand in that, actually. This kind of just follows weird, bizarre, uncanny experience, I guess, of Naomi Klein being confused for this person who is also kind of anti-corporate, but from the complete other perspective. And she speaks of this kind of mirror world where views on the left are kind of being co-opted by the right to mean completely different things. But if you don't have a really strong understanding of what is meant when it's used on the left, you could quite easily find yourself flipping from the far left to the far right, which I think a lot of us can relate to as seeing friends and family do during the pandemic. And it was a really bizarre time politically. Oh, my cat. Okay, we're just doing this now. Like, this is just how we're gonna film this part of the video. This is Tigger. I don't know if you heard that, he's purring. It looks like we just have my little cat here, but I also feel like you might not be able to see him, but he's here, if you're wondering why I'm like consistently patting nothing. This Substack piece I read recently and honestly was so moving. It's by a daughter of Pearl and it's called Girlhood Exists in Palestine. You just have to dig under the rubble to find it. I think there's a huge dehumanization of victims sometimes, particularly Palestinian victims are so often dehumanized by our media. It's a beautiful piece about this author, Haya, went to Palestine when she was a kid and she bought herself a red nail polish. And it's just sort of like her memoir of that experience, being in Palestine, wanting a reminder of home, which for her was the United States, but also the kind of juxtaposition of even back then being in Palestine, in Gaza, and having the constant threat of raids and bombs and military siege and the terror that instilled in everybody, but also the everydayness of that being a reality. The benign nature of it all just being normal almost makes it so much worse, because this is a reality that people in Gaza have been living with for years. Really highly recommend The Death of the Public Intellectual by B, The Digital Meadow. And this is a kind of similar exploration of the idea that we don't seem to have any public intellectuals anymore. The idea that people would sit around these presidential debates years and years ago, listen to what people had to say and be genuinely invested and significantly interested in what people had to say from this intellectual lens. And I think it's quite interesting in the context of the recent political debates between Biden and Trump, and just how bizarre they were, how almost had nothing to do with political thought, theory, policy at all, and instead were just cheap shots. The complete anti-intellectual narrative is completely clouding idols that are presenting ideas in a formatted, clear, logical sequencing. And these people exist. Like, these people are writing books. These people are doing incredible things. These people include Naomi Klein and Neil Postman. And last but not least is a piece that I actually read this morning. It is by Discourse blog Jack Crosby, called Imagine If This Was Any Other Toy. And this one's about AI. It's about chatbots, and it's about the complete lack of responsibility and regulation around chatbots. The level of destruction with chatbots and AI at the moment is appalling. The lack of regulation around them to ensure that they do not allow certain really harmful messaging, encouragement of certain acts, which I can't say on here. The fact that AI is designed to mirror and support viewpoints that you have, has very little ethical basis, has very little kind of overarching social good embedded in it, has very little kind of principle of progressing towards morality, which are all questions I think in themselves that if we all came together and decided that AI should be more moral, who would decide what more moral would look like? Who would decide what the parameters for ethical would be? Who would decide what's allowed and what isn't allowed? These are all genuine philosophical questions that are going to make things like this very difficult. Moral dilemmas cloud the entirety of AI and technology. But yeah, I think what the real problem is, we live in a society where oligarchy is definitely in full swing. Billionaires are ruling the world. Billionaires are ruling the wealthiest Western nation in the world. And one of those billionaires happens to be Sam Altman, who owns OpenAI. To regulate this kind of technology is going to be a really big challenge that we're going to see over the next few years, and it's one to watch quite closely. And I think this was just a really great, quick piece to read that just highlights that expecting regulation is pretty tricky when these people have such influence. I'm not going to end on a negative note. I'm going to end on the note that suggests we can get there. We can get there. It's a little bit like the lady protests too much. Like, I've really been like, but it's all going to be okay, offering literally no solution. I'm hyper aware. Sorry, guys. We have to have positive attitude. We really do. It's a tricky world we live in, but the difficulties that we're facing today are evidence of difficulties that humanity faces all the time, has faced all the time. There has never been an era where society has not faced a significant oppressive problem. There has never been a time where humanity has not been significantly disenfranchised by different events, whether or not that be wars or natural tragedies or oppressive regimes. This is not unique. We are not unique. And I say that in the most loving way. We can get through this. We've gotten through everything else. We can get through this. Evidence shows that we do get through this. In fact, the world has never ended before. It's not going to end now. It's important that we go through with hope. It's important that we educate ourselves and read as much as we can from amazing people who are advocating and believe in a better society and a better world. Imagination is probably one of the most powerful things that we have. Yeah, reading fiction has really helped me to be able to visualize something different and visualize a world that works, a world that doesn't oppress, a world that doesn't exploit. I highly recommend getting your hands around a good book. And on that note, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in my next video, which will be a video essay. There's a couple of topics that I'm tossing over at the moment, so it'll be something that I've probably put in a poll recently on YouTube. Once again, love you guys so much. Feel free to follow me on Substack and follow me on Instagram, and I'll see you guys soon. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day, lovely rest of the week. Sending lots of love your way. Let me know what your favorite reads have been recently, and yeah.